Jai Guru, everyone.
Jai Guru.
Hello, welcome to the Yogananda podcast. We're on chapter 12, part 16 today. How is everyone doing?
Great.
Excellent.
We were just talking before we recorded that we got the memos on the color code, the blue team and the red team. We're all part of the one team.
Red team are gonna introduce what happened last episode.
Yes. So last episode, it was a lot about Sri Yukteswar and his quite different approach to women at the time. He had a very balanced view and saw people as souls, which is a very good lesson for us. And he also gave quite clear counsel on sex and the sexual impulse. And we also learned how he interacted with devotees who really wanted to overcome the impulse and was quite caring and understanding. So it was a really lovely insight into Sri Yukteswar last episode.
Thank you, Lauren. Mike, what was one standout feature of that episode for you that you're always going to remember till you die?
You just want to put me on the spot for no reason.
I like watching Mike squirm. It's pastime.
No, I refuse.
Good pastime.
Yeah.
Stay tuned for more squirming. Okay, so this
also I wasn't there at that episode.
Yeah. So you think that's an excuse? As if you haven't read the Autobiography of a Yogi a million gazillion times. Mm-hmm. Firstly, let's talk about this section is where Sri Yukteswar talks really about his experience with his mother, and it carries on with the theme actually, because we talked about how he used to interact with his other ladies and other people at his ashram. So now we get to hear about how he interacted with his mother even after his self-realized state. So firstly, it says Sri Yukteswar, his mother lived in the Rana Mahal district of Benares, where I had first visited my guru. And he kind of, Mukunda said he was watching them from the balcony, which would imply that Mukunda went with Sri Yukteswar to Benares to see his guru and to see his guru's mother. We don't know much about that journey, but we assume that he was invited to go along. That's quite nice little trip for them. It's kind of like it's in the plot, but you have to really read it to get that out. And so then Mukunda describes her, or Paramahansa Yogananda describes her as gracious and kindly. She was yet a woman of decided opinions. Firstly, let's talk about mothers in general, because these are very nice words that Mukunda is using, very politically correct words as well, very harmonious sounding words. So let's talk about mothers and kind of epitome of like unconditional love that they have for their children, and it seems to extend not just for human relationships. It sounds, I'm in front of a field right now with a gazillion sheep, and watching little lambs following around their mother, and their mother selflessly loving their children, their fowl, is quite nice. So it kind of like runs along the whole of creation and all of anyone that's born, essentially, and extends to the animal kingdom, doesn't it? It's quite nice. But it's quite nice for us, especially for most of us anyway, who have been fortunate enough to have a very loving and giving mother. And obviously we talk about how revered they are in India before. Much comparisons have been made to Divine Mother and our birth mother, and they're almost treated with the same level of sanctity in terms of never kind of disrespecting them, honoring them, following whatever they say to the letter. So it's all very very beautifully done in India.
I wonder how Guruji felt watching Sri Yukteswar with his mum, because obviously his mum had passed, and I wonder how that affected him, if at all. I don't have any sort of assumptions about it, but yeah, it just came to mind. I wonder how that must have been for him, watching a scene like that.
Get a bit of a glimpse of it in terms of his reaction here to this little incident that's in this section. So hopefully we'll uncover a little bit more of that.
Yeah.
But it seems this relationship is appreciated even by avatars like Sri Yukteswar here, how he treats his mother, but also Mukunda, how he treated and how he loves his birth mother. He kind of dedicates many sections of the book, doesn't he, to his lovely mother. So it's quite comforting to us to and quite inspiring for us, I suppose, to compare that to how we should have, or the relationship we should have with our mothers. But this, Chris?
Yeah, it sort of sparks a bit of a comedy-esque take in my mind to some degree, that when I think of Sri Yukteswar, I think of, you know, this giant of a, you know, figure, and so all-knowing. He's avatar of wisdom, but yet to someone's eyes, he's their little boy. Like he'll always be their little boy, you know. And to Guruji's point that we should play our role in this life of Maya to the best possible outcome that we can, but still we have to play the roles. We still have to play some sort of role, you know, relationship with our brother, sister, mom or dad or sibling, you know, whatever that is. We do have to still play this role in this like play of Maya that we find ourselves in. And Sri Yukteswar plays it very well, even though he is, you know, seen in my eyes like a god walking on earth, you know, this realized master. But still, he's humble enough to know his role in this sense and play it very well.
Does humble Chris have anything like that he'd like to say to his mother, who I'm sure is listening and watching this from past experience?
It's offered me a juxtaposition, so it's a learning opportunity for me, seeing Sri Yukteswar playing the role well. But my mum's been blessed with a mother that was you know, the epitome of what a mother should be, quote unquote. So
lovely.
Shout out to mum.
Lovely. Was she also gracious and kindly, yet of very decidedly a woman of very decided opinions? It's like she was. It kind of seems to apply to most good mothers, isn't it? This, but it's like a feedback sandwich without being a feedback sandwich, isn't it? Mike?
Mothers, they have such a special role in everyone's life. They're usually the first person who gives you love when you incarnate, and you never really forget that. And I think Guruji says somewhere that the mother's love is given to us not to spoil us, but to soften our hearts when our character is built. So it's very important. And then later in life, of course, the relationship between children and the mother changes a lot, but this kind of loving bond is still there in some shape or form.
Indeed. So Mukunda was effectively looking on to Sri Yukteswar from a balcony vantage point. So going on, let's talk about the influence that mothers and sons have on each other from Mukunda's eyes as this conversation or this little scene was unfolding. So he describes here in his sensible and quiet way, Sri Yukteswar was trying to convince her of something. And he says it was apparently unsuccessful because she was shaking her head with great rigor. So what do you think? What kind of things do you think? We're not privy to what what they were talking about. Only that kind of she responds saying, "No, no, you go away. I'm not. Your wise words aren't for me. I'm not your disciple." What kind of things, Mike, do you think, with that clue?
So one thing that I remember I talked with my mother about often was like, I was at some point the relationship has changed 180. I remember when I grew up, she would tell me I have to eat this and I shouldn't do that. And then at some point it had been the other way around, where I went to my mom and like, you shouldn't be eating this. Or maybe it was something like that. And then she went to him and said, no, you can tell me what to do. I'm your mother.
Interesting.
Yeah, I think along the same lines, perhaps even, something to do with spiritual life, or what something she could do to enhance her development, maybe, perhaps, because she says, your wise words are not for me, I'm not your disciple. So, but at least she said that they were wise. It was sort of hidden in there. She's acknowledged that what he's saying is wise, but it's just not for her ears.
The other clue is in the next paragraph or so. It's written that she was in one of her unreasonable moods, which I'm sure we can relate to when having conversations with our parents, especially when we're younger. But Sri Yukteswar here is obviously from a vantage point of not just a son, but he's head of an ashram. He's got renown in the area and probably in India at this time for being a scholar of ancient Indian law. But so the conversation could be about family matters, as Mike kind of alluded to, perhaps diet. Maybe she had diabetes and he was trying to convince her to take control, something like that. But it could also be something like personal pride that's really affecting her. These are kind of common things that I've experienced with my elders in India, and also spiritual commitment as well. That would make a lot of sense if he's trying to convince her to just follow some simple sadhana, or perhaps more sadhana than she is currently following. But she's obviously set in her ways. Those are kind of things that I imagine. I know, listeners, why don't you let us know what kind of things you imagine in this conversation, Chris?
You said the sort of magic words, set in her ways, like she's set in her way, and that actually is a topic that's kind of in our face here in some way, that you could probably talk about all episode. Can we break it down and talk about how this happens and what's the mechanisms behind it and all the rest of it. But it's just impressive again to me that these roles that we played, no matter how significant the individual is in front of you, if you've got your mind made up, you've got your own willpower, even when God's essentially reaching out his own hand through an avatar like this, in some ways, if it is about spiritual benefit, just how strong our own willpower is, how we should be mindful of that to wield it in the right way.
I remember there was a distinct moment in my life where I remember that my I don't know how to say it with humbleness, but my intelligence raised to a point where I was equal to my mother's, let's say. And then at a point you can actually, it's a two-way thing, isn't it? It isn't just mother teaching son or father teaching son, but actually the son can have, or a daughter can have influence and impart some little gems of wisdom that they may have acquired that the mother may not have. And then that point, the balance kind of shifts, doesn't it? Did you experience that, Chris? And did your mum or dad, who are probably listening, did they listen to you at that point?
I probably have a few stories that are maybe turning points, like milestones in my life like that I think probably everybody maybe has one or two of these moments, but I deemed it less intelligence, but more maybe willpower, like I mentioned before, where Guruji talks about this, the will of the child, when it's a baby, it's completely dependent, and then goes on to another stage where, it's developing its own will and doesn't want to be clothed and doesn't want to be fed, and starts being a bit temperamental. This is the development of will within the power of man. which is maybe just slightly different to intelligence. But I do remember choosing not to remain in my church. I'd been a Protestant when I was young. My mum thought, oh, great, you know, you're going to be a Catholic now. I left. And it's like, no, I'm not going to do that either. I wanted to go down my own path. And at the time, this was, you know, this was a big deal. So she's happy. She's happy now. So we've come back to an understanding after time has passed. But certainly, yeah, we've got to make our own ways in life. And mothers, I think that's a big milestone for mothers as well, is to let the child go out into the risky world, away from their protection.
It must be tough for them, I imagine, because that shift, it must be quite jarring in a way. But for my mum, it was slightly different because we moved to India, and we moved from India to the UK, and her English was pretty poor, and you know, so it's a new country, and then when I became, you know, in my teens, my English, my comprehension became slightly better than hers, and then so she would it was natural for her to say, okay, there's an important letter here, you read this and tell us what we should do, because my comprehension was better. So it was like kind of like we were eased into that kind of relationship, but that may not be so for all families. But one wonders why in this case, if there was words of wisdom shared by someone of eminence, clear eminence, as Sri Yukteswar, because he's respected not just amongst his little, you know, troop of family members or little people in the ashram, little group in the ashram, but you know, in the area, in India perhaps, why you wouldn't listen to words of wisdom. Can you? It's difficult to get your head around that. But could it be to do with pride, perhaps? You know, it's difficult. We're just obviously imagining. But I was also thinking about. Oh yeah, Mike.
It's also that relationships, they don't really change. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, especially with people that I've known for 20, 30 years. I'm not going to date myself by saying 40, but it's the dynamic of the relationship, it changes gradually. And I feel that Sri Yukteswar has his hermitage in a different city, and then when he comes back to his mom, he's her son mostly, and so she hasn't really experienced him much being this leader of this organization. She's mostly seen her son coming back on visits, and so I'm guessing that his mom, she hears the stories of him being that great guru, but that doesn't mean that she is part of that in any way. For her, nothing changed really between the two, and so I can see that dynamic, and it must feel surreal for someone from the perspective of Mukunda, who's only seen the lion of Bengal, you know, and now suddenly he's before his mom and getting scolded. That must be funny to him.
Yeah, it would have been good to watch this from afar anyway. Chris,
what do you think, guys? Does this tell us that just how special each and every one of us are? If it's as special as what we see Sri Yukteswar as, and we would be revering with Sri Yukteswar, bowing at his feet, and the mother, she's like, you know, go pick up the shopping, you know, for me, you know, sort of ordering him around or something, treating him, you know, like the boy that she knew. That's the love of the mother is equal. Doesn't matter how great they become, in a sense, the reality of, you know, what they achieve. But maybe you could invert that and say that's then spreads across all of mankind. You know, mother's love is equal for everyone.
Yeah.
Was I detecting, when you were impersonating Sri Yukteswar's mother, was I detecting a slight Northern Irish accent there?
No, that would be significantly stronger.
Yeah, this. But in terms of listening, it must have been in this situation. We can only imagine what the exact scenario was, as we have done. but it was for whatever reason very difficult for his mother, Sri Yukteswar's mother, to wield and to listen. And I was thinking, rather than being critical, uber critical of her, I was thinking we ourselves, we probably, how much of Guruji's teachings do we take on? And we are disciples. She says, I'm not your disciple, and she's not listening to maybe this little bit of wisdom. But Guruji gives us, this mountain of wisdom, and we still seem to trip over and fall over here and there and make so many mistakes and go back and, reflect and introspect and make changes, and then a few years later we may come back and make the same mistake again. So we are not immune to Sri Yukteswar's mother syndrome, even though we are disciples. So we should feel a bit of sympathy for poor Sri Yukteswar's mother here.
Is it too cheeky to say how boring would it be if we were perfect all the time? That we're actually on this earth to ease out these blemishes in us. And Sri Yukteswar said himself in the Holy Signs that, thank God for individualism. It would be terrible if we were all the same. So, individualism is what creates this wonderful world that we live in. And part and parcel, there's errors in there. It's not perfect, but then in its imperfections, perfection.
True that. I'm personally, I'm happy with boring. I don't mind. If it gets, whatever gets me there.
Yeah. Well, we're probably sitting, we realize that we've been and being held back time and time again, and now we want to graduate. It's
yes. So Sri Yukteswar then Mukunda says he backed away like a scolded child, and he didn't venture a further debate. And that's also a good point for us to take on in terms of when we meet a path of resistance with people, and we keep pressing, and that causes more friction. But here Sri Yukteswar said what he needed to say, let it sink in with his mother, and then he didn't carry on, even though he may have known more than what he told him, but he didn't carry on for the sake of harmony, for the sake of peace between the two, and probably for her sake as well.
And it shows that he wants to play this role as a son in an exemplary way. Like most of the lives of the great ones, they always play their role in life, and they try to do it with all the qualities that. And here, Guruji talks about humility, and he could say to her, "Do you know who I am?" and start a big fight or something. But it's really about showing this love and reverence for the mother, what is important to him. And for the reader of this book, it's a role model.
Indeed. And Mukunda says he was touched by the great respect for his mother, even in her unreasonable moods. And here we get a bit more of a glimpse into the nature of this discussion, where Mukunda or Paramahansa Yogananda reflects and says she saw him only as her little boy, not as a sage. So you kind of get the feeling or the dynamic. I suppose it'd be quite hard for mothers to let go of their son who has become an avatar, because in many ways nature has imprinted on them that they're always, the son, they're always the little boy or little girl. It's tough for them, I imagine, especially in this type of scenario where they reach their ultimate nature. And Mukunda then says that there was charm about this trifling incident. So he really enjoyed this. He must have been moved by it. And he said it supplied a side light on my guru's unusual nature. And he describes this as unusual, being inwardly humble, and outwardly unbendable. It's a bit, I was reflecting on this being inwardly humble and outwardly unbendable, and I was wondering what those qualities could be. I think we're quite clear on what outwardly unbendable would be. Unbendable is, you're resolute, you have truth, and you've committed your life to that truth that you've realized or been taught by your guru, and you are unbendable. And I'm sure each of us can give specific examples of our unbendable nature. For me, I'll give you an example. Meditating every day and praying to God and gurus or energization, is part of an unbendable part of my daily routine, regardless of what is planned for that day. I try to make the time and the effort and the energy for those things. But I was wondering what inwardly humble means. I'm a bit more confused about that. Chris?
And brushing your teeth, Priyank. What the essentials of the day. So yeah, I agree with your assessment there in the outwardly unbendable. I think we saw examples of that already throughout this chapter, where you would have somebody go and say something, a visitor say something to Sri Yukteswar, and he would give them the silent treatment. Outwardly unbendable, he's just a resolute character. But humble, that whenever I think about this in one of the previous episodes where we talked about Kumar, the example there, where when we have the examples that he didn't influence young Mukunda as well in his decisions to a major degree. He did, give his influence, but then didn't go to interfere in their will and their decision. And I think this is actually what I interpret this incident to be as well. So he humbly backed away after trying to, give some kind of advice or, to talk to his mother about something. So he's humble enough to not try to enforce his will on others and say that he knows better or they should, step in line into his way of seeing things. Whereas we would assume that he probably was quite right in what he was saying, if it was spiritual advice or something like that. He certainly didn't force anybody to comply.
That's one example of inwardly humble, I suppose. Good one. That's what we're talking about. Is this unusual though? Or my guru's unusual nature? I'm thinking of other qualities that Chris, go on.
Wouldn't really know, to be honest, because I haven't really looked at many gurus. I've been fortunate enough to land on one that really, clicked with my heart and soul, and I haven't really had to venture too far elsewhere. But quite possibly, this is not all that. This is quite rare, quite possibly, yeah.
I suppose it kind of makes sense that it's unusual, because I suppose if you're very inwardly humble, a lot of us would then translate that to the external, right? It's very obvious how inwardly humble we are through actions and speech and whatnot. But I suppose with Sri Yukteswar, he knows when to express it and when not to. He's got that iron balance, hasn't he? Which is probably the unusual part. He can still be humble whilst being very resolute and firm. So yeah, it kind of makes sense to me that it's an unusual pairing in that way.
Thank you. Well explained, Lauren. So the next section is about the monastic regulations and how Sri Yukteswar did not maintain them, and how that's related to Shankaracharya, Adi Shankaracharya, and how he did not not always follow them, shall we say. So it says in this section that monastic regulations don't permit a Swami to retain connection with worldly ties after their formal severance, i.e. you're formally severing them And I looked at the yogananda.org website on this topic, and the SRF general requirements for being a monastic, and the things you have to renounce are apparently that individual consideration is given to each applicant's circumstances and qualifications. Like, for example, I know some monastics, some of the monastics have got aging parents, and they still are allowed to, care for them in a way that a son who is not a monastic would. So SRF has also imbibed this, this flexible approach to the monastic vows that are usually quite rigid in Indian kind of religious and in the Hindu custom. So in the SRF's case, you have to be single, you have to be in good physical and mental health. I think you have to be between ages of 18 to 40. You have to be free from family and other obligations. And this is what this section is kind of referring to. You have to be a student of SRF, of course, and you have to be able to speak English well for all of Guruji's much work that's required. And here in the next section, it says that he, or a Swami, may not perform the ceremonial family rites that are obligatory for the householder. So here we get a kind of description of what that is, because non-Indians may not be familiar with what ceremonial family rites that he's referring to, but we're going to talk about that in a bit more detail, taking the example of Adi Shankaracharya, who is again here described as the ancient reorganizer of the ancient Swami order. And it says he also disregarded some of those injunctions. He said, after the death of his beloved mother, he cremated her body with the heavenly fire that he caused to spurt from his upraised hands. Very mystical. But if you'll remember from chapter 10 and our part 9 episode, there was a specific story about his mother being very hesitant to allow Shankaracharya to become a sannyasi. And there was an incident where Shankaracharya kind of made up a kind of a scenario about a crocodile, capturing him and him being stuck in the water, and him asking his mother to release him from his duties. And you can hear more about that in chapter 10, part 9. But as part of that incident, his mother gave him permission to leave the formal family kind of obligations and become a sannyasi on the condition that he would be present during her death and follow all the rituals that are recommended in the Shastras. So he then agreed to that, but he's technically he wasn't allowed to agree to that, because once you renounce in India as a sannyasi, you renounce your family, children, all that you leave behind, and you can't go back. Apparently when he was doing all his work in the north of India, he intuitively knew when his mother was going to pass, and he came towards the south in Kerala where she was. And when she was, on her deathbed, he stayed with her. These are the kind of things that he shouldn't have been allowed to do if he was following the rigid kind of system that was in place back then. And he stayed with her, as I said, and when she died, he went back. But he was quite sad. He said that he could not give water to her at the time of death. So, for example, when someone passes in India, one of the customs is to when their souls left the body, you feed the body with Ganga Jal, which is holy water, essentially from the river Ganga. You put a few drops into the mouth before they're cremated. So here Shankaracharya is saying he was very sad that he couldn't perform that rite, but he obviously did do the rite of cremating her through the process that's mystically described in this section. And he also said that he could not do one of the mantras that was required for a specific yuga. And he's basically saying he's essentially very sorry that he couldn't do all those things. But all these things he's not actually supposed to do or allowed to do, being a renunciant. But here this section of the autobiography describes why that's not so important, and we're going to talk about that in a bit of detail here. So Sri Yukteswar is also ignored some of these restrictions, and it says in a fashion far less spectacular. So when his mother passed on, he arranged for her to be cremated, and then he also fed the Brahmins, which is also another of the customs that the eldest son usually has to perform in conformance with the householder rights and duties. So now this is the crunch of this whole section. It says here that the Shastric prohibitions were intended to help swamis to overcome narrow identifications. Shankara and Sri Yukteswar had wholly merged their being with impersonal spirit. So they needed no rescue by rule. Sometimes too, a master purposefully ignores a canon in order to uphold its principles as superior to and independent of the form. Thus, Jesus plucked ears of corn on the day of rest. To the inevitable critics, he said, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. And that is a very powerful section of that, and powerful quote from the Bible that Guruji often quotes. It's from Mark 2:27. And Guruji has put a whole discourse on this very topic in the second coming of Christ. And I found a few lovely sections of this book which will further kind of describe the importance of this message, I suppose, for not just for monastics, but for all of us that religiously adopt and carry on traditions without perhaps with only blind belief and things like that. So here, Lauren, if you'd like to start us off, please.
And this is from Discourse 32. It says, the dogmatic priest of ancient times might be so fanatical about observing the Sabbath day that he would not leave his home and take a carriage to bring a doctor for his dying brother, servant, or guest. To follow the Sabbath law while forswearing justified and critical needs, such as to ignore giving aid to a helpless person, is a sin, for it breaks a higher law of divine love and service and disregards the dictates of conscience, which in turn disturbs inner harmony with God. To take rest on the Sabbath for communion with God, occasionally breaking the vow of interiorization for a legitimate purpose, would not contradict the spirit of observing that holy day. That is why Jesus taught his disciples that rules of conduct are for their betterment, and thus should not be followed blindly, but may be modified with strict reason, though not license, when necessary.
Jesus defended his disciples who were inwardly observing the Sabbath in his holy company and service, even though from hunger they had plucked and eaten a few ears of grain as a matter of necessity. Jesus thereto reminded the critics about the story of David, who lived in the grace of God and who, when he was in need and hungry, went into the house of God and asked of the priest the sacred shewbread for himself and his companions, even though it was contrary to the law for anyone to eat it, but priests in God's service.
If a literal adherence to scriptural injunction could be set aside for spiritual David in order to serve a higher purpose, how much more did Jesus, who was one with God, have the right to disregard outward nuances of the law when he saw that its spirit was truly fulfilled?
Nice. And for those who didn't know, like me, can you also read that section about the shewbread, Mike?
The shewbread was a ritual offered of 12 newly baked loaves placed each Sabbath on a table in the temple sanctuary and sprinkled with incense. They were left there until the following Sabbath, when the incense was burned and they were eaten by the priests and replaced by 12 new loaves. It was forbidden to remove them from the sanctuary. Interesting.
There you have it. Mr. Guruji expertly uses lots of examples from Christian traditions and Judaic traditions to emphasize the perils of blindly following certain injunctions. Mike?
So when a master breaks the rules that are set in dogma, I totally understand why he does that, and oftentimes it's inconvenient. But it also is a lesson for us that when we have really strict rules, and sometimes two rules, they kind of contradict each other, or we find it it's very inconvenient to follow this rule right now, then maybe sometimes it's okay to kind of be a bit less strict.
Indeed. And we should be a bit thankful for it as well in the West, because SRF and Yogananda has changed some of the, and Babaji, I suppose, has changed the requirements for Kriya Bandhs, right? And lessened the this very strict requirements. And lots of orthodox yogic paths kind of not condemn it, but they say this is not the way, essentially. And obviously Yogananda being an avatar and a yoga avatar, he has changed little bits here and there to adapt the ways for us in the West. Things like sitting on a chair, these kind of things aren't necessarily very favorably looked upon, even within other paths that span from Sri Yukteswar, for example. Not Sri Yukteswar, sorry, from Lahiri Mahashaya. They don't like certain aspects of how the West practice meditation techniques, but it goes quite far beyond that, of course. And here we have a kind of explanation about all that kind of stuff. Mike?
Also, Babaji made it easy. He lowered the threshold for people to receive Kriya Yoga, as we'll see in this book. And the whole idea of being a householder and at the same time being a yogi, that I don't think that's the traditionally those would be two separate things that don't really mix, but here they do. So I guess that's where a lot of those compromises come from.
Indeed. So moving on to other scriptures. Sri Yukteswar was very well read, but he didn't actually read that much. That's what it's described here. He was minutely and infinitely aware of lots of different branches of knowledge and scripture, but he didn't read that much, Mukunda is saying. He was also aware and kept abreast of what in my profession we called CPD, continuous professional development. He says, latest scientific discoveries he was aware of. So I wonder he must have got some scientific journals, Western ones probably, sent to him on a subscription basis, because he was aware of advancements in all sorts of fields. But also it says here that when he so decided, Master could instantly attune himself to the mind of any man, as is described in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras 319. His powers as a human radio and the nature of thoughts are explained there. So I was reading Sri M's book, An Apprentice to a Himalayan Master, just recently. And in that, he meets this he meets this his guru, and his guru starts speaking to people in various different languages. And then he asks his guru, how do you, you don't speak this language, how are you aware of it? And he said essentially exactly this. He connected to the other person's mind and memory and intellect, and just used that store of knowledge and just essentially downloaded the language. And here Sri Yukteswar is kind of saying the same thing, but not even needing that person to be in the mere presence from the other side of the globe is enough, apparently. You can just tune in, connect, and download. Mike, was he uploading anything?
I was just thinking I wouldn't be reading many books either if I could just download people's minds into mine. I would just think, who's that author? Let me just tune into him, and then yeah, very interesting. So I don't blame him for not reading that many books, especially back in those days. I think it was the science, everything was much less developed, and I think being able to read minds probably got you up to date of science pretty quickly. He probably had like his morning brief or something during his morning meditation. Then was ready.
You skipped my question. Do you think Sri Yukteswar uploaded anything?
Hopefully. I think I would love for Sri Yukteswar to upload something into my mind. I hope I feel like he does every now and then. So that would be a blessing for everyone if that happened.
Nice. So yeah, Sri Yukteswar did have a commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, which didn't get published. I think he worked on half of it, and then the other half wasn't complete properly or something like that. So it hasn't yet been published. It's not, I don't think it's in the hands of Self-Realization Fellowship, but yeah, that's just conjecture. But Sri Yukteswar was apparently a brilliant conversationalist. He said he exchanged views on countless topics with his guests, countless guests. And it would probably be quite interesting having this conversation with someone who could just download every point that you have to make on any given topic, and then for them to like someone like Sri Yukteswar to like switch it and approach it from a different angle and make you really churn that knowledge that you think you had.
I would think he must have surprised a lot of people who thought they were very much into popular science, and then they go meet this yogi who they think would be on the other end of the spectrum, and then they might be surprised that he is actually up to date on all the significant advances of the world and has great conversations on it.
Indeed. And this footnote also mentions Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. Where else have we heard Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, Chris? You're muted. Was that on purpose?
My mic's broken. In the lessons, of course. Right. Is that what you're referring to?
Oh, tell me. You tell me.
Yes, in the lessons on taking Kriya, you get the eightfold path laid out too.
And what is the eightfold path?
You're going to ask me to do it blindfolded someday.
Well, this one surely you knew was coming. Come on, it's mentioned.
I should know by now. Yeah. You've got the one that I'm probably doing terrible at right now, which is the asana posture. need to follow that one for sure. Asanas, the yama, the niyama, the pranayama, dhyana. Is that how you pronounce it?
Next is pratyahara. Pranayama, pratyahara.
In order, okay, yeah, you're gonna catch me.
No, you don't need to do it in order. It's fine. You can go the others.
Well, you've got samadhi as well.
Yeah, that's the last one. Yeah.
The other two.
Dharana and dhyana.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
we repeat it. Yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. So we'll hopefully, it's pointless me memorizing this. It's I'm sure you're going to get to that latter one before me. And
I find it helpful that you guys keep reciting those. I learned already that I thought, like Chris, that yamas were the do's and niyamas were the don'ts, and that way I learned it's the other way around. So keep it up.
Nice one.
Yeah.
Nice one. So we're well versed with some of Patanjali's great work.
What we're going to cover in the next episode, a little spoiler, is the practical application of these things is what counts, of the scholarly knowledge. Just
yeah, that's where I'm found wanting. Get me to memorize anything, I'm there. I'm your man. All right. So Guruji was Param Guruji, I should say, was a brilliant conversationalist, and he says that he had a ready supply of wit and had a rollicking laugh which enlivened every discussion. Oh, how much would you pay to have a recording of one of those witty and lovely conversations? Oh man, if only. It's funny because microphones were around at that time. We could have recorded through Yukteswar's voice somewhere, somehow, but just never didn't. That wasn't part of the divine schema.
Yeah, I would have loved to know what his laugh was like, because I suppose in this line that we're going to read about his demeanor, let's say, he was never in a mood. He was maybe grave, but never solemn or down about things. I picture him many times as a grave, stern disciplinarian. But this is great, to hear about this, that is laugh and live in every discussion, not just occasionally. So yeah, I would have loved to have heard his laugh, rollicking laugh.
Yeah, and Sri Yukteswar used to often say, apparently, to seek the Lord, men need not disfigure their faces. I find this funny because I often, probably unfairly, mock certain close people in my life when they're in a mood or unhappy, and you can see their expression, their unhappiness in their face. And I quote something similar to this line, and it doesn't make for a very positive conversation, but I seem to enjoy it anyway. But Sri Yukteswar then says that he quotes from the Bible saying, "Remember that finding God will mean the funeral of all sorrows." Sounds like a good cremation or funeral to go to, doesn't it? the only good type, I imagine. And on this topic, on the second coming of Christ, Discourse 28, Jesus teaches his followers how to pray. The Sermon on the Mount, part 3. I've got a section on this. Lauren, would you like to start?
Jesus, however, pointed out the hypocrisy of those who fast or practiced other austerities, not to draw closer to God, but to impress others by the privations they are capable of enduring. Imagining suffering to be a prerequisite of transcendence and self-inflicted penance to be evidence of exaltation, they attempt to hasten their ascent, if not in actuality, at least in the eyes of their public.
Such perverted notions of spirituality are one reason many persons hesitate to embrace a serious search for God, believing it will require a lack of sackcloth and ashes, a life of sackcloth and ashes. Nothing could be further from the truth. To know God is to know joy itself. True devotees are never gloomy or morose. They know that to be cheerful is to please God. The greater one's happiness, the greater his divine attunement. Their thoughts full fully on me, their being surrendered to me, enlightening one another, proclaiming me always. My devotees are contented and joyful.
Very nice.
That's like an advertisement for being spiritual, because it's a happy path. Yeah.
Advertisement and prerequisites for the role.
Yeah, if you're not happy, you can't do it. Yeah.
Get out of here.
Isn't there some quote by a saint who said a saint that is sad is a sad saint? I think it's somewhere also in the autobiography. Yeah.
Yeah. Lauren, do you meet these prerequisites?
What's that? What, being joyful?
Being joyful and contented and proclaiming him always.
Not quite.
Never being gloomy or morose.
No, I'm not quite. I wish. Perhaps one day. I'm naturally a bit joyous.
Yeah, I don't think I've seen you gloomy or morose.
No, but I think, we all have our moments, don't we? Where Maya and the mud gets heavy, right? But yeah, I mean, I think naturally as we go along the path, and particularly if things are going favorably for us, we do sort of enter a natural state of sort of peace and joy, right, and love. So yeah, onwards and upwards, hopefully, for all of us.
So what you're saying is, if I spend enough time with you in the future, then I'll experience those morose and gloomy moments.
Oh well, I don't know about that, Frank.
Good stuff. Good stuff. Chris, tell us what's happening next time.
Yes. So next episode, we're going to cover the 17th part of chapter 12. Now the topic is quite simple, really. There's visitors into the hermitage. Now we have different types of visitors, all types really. Philosophers, professors, lawyers, scientists. We get a few examples, a couple of key examples, one of a chemist and one of a scholar. And really, in these examples, we can take some really key learnings that will unpack the difference between knowledge, true knowledge, and intellectualism, humility in learning, the practical application of these learnings and the knowledge. And we'll look at a bit of self-examination and open-mindedness as well. So yeah, lots to unpack in the next part.
Very good. Very much looking forward to it. And thank you, the three of you, and to all of our listeners and viewers. And we shall see you next time. Jai Guru.
Jai Guru.